Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I am Rhombus Tix, and I am reading Chapter 10 of Micronation to you. Chapter 10, Growing. Work was very slow at first. I spent a lot of time reading. Fleur was a great place in many ways. They had a free accredited university with some very unusual courses. I was currently taking psychology, yoga, and escapology. Prow kept looking for unusual threats or cases, but he wasn't actually investigating anything. This disturbed me because I didn't want the maniac disrupting the gravy train. Darla had always done this kind of research for us in the past, but she hadn't hooked up with Prow in any way since the first meeting that I was aware of. Prow looked like himself, of course, but I could tell his heart wasn't really in it. We both had reasons for being here, but I doubt Prow was in it for the money. Finally, out of desperation, I started emailing Prow about unusual articles that I found. He rejected them all. Prow couldn't function without some kind of filter, and right now he wasn't responding to me. Don't get me wrong, I was quite confident he needed me as a sounding board once he found his case, but finding it was Darla's job. I sent an email to Darla about it. I suggested Amberlove. Apparently, Amberlove had become married and had 2 children while I was in the slammer. The world certainly had moved on without me, whether I liked it or not. What we needed was an actual intelligence analyst, not a Prow, if you could even call him an analyst. I met with Michael Onyx in his cramped little office to discuss the situation. It was only a 5 by 10 room, little more than a bathroom. My office was 5 times that size. Prow's was 10 times larger. I expected resentment, but strangely there wasn't any. "How can I help you, Chester?" Michael said. "We need someone to gather data for Prow to look at. I've tried, but I'm useless at it." You know, half the security staff thinks you two are only a gesture of love from Mr. Ferret to Mrs. Ferret. Not surprising, really. I see. And the other half? Michael beamed. The other half know Darla too well. She suffers no fools, not unless she has to, and Mr. Prow is, yes, believe me, I know. So which half do you fall in? I asked. The latter. I will speak with Gerald. We will get you your analyst. It took 2 weeks, but Darren Lloyd arrived with no fanfare whatsoever. One day, he just met with Prow and conducted an interview to find out what he was looking for, and the next he started sending Prow vast streams of data. My reaction to this was mixed. On the one hand, I was ecstatic, but I was also suspicious. It just seemed too easy. Third, I was afraid he would find something for Prow to investigate. The last thing I wanted to do was to collect more samples. Lysol got his information from a wide variety of sources. I quietly followed him for a day just to get a better understanding of his routine. In the morning, he waited about her complex, talking to people and listening to their stories. He did the same thing in the evenings. Every afternoon, he squeezed the internet like a lemon, getting every last drop of useful information he could. And Prow drank it up. Somehow, he made a connection with Lysol, and Prow was always eager to hear more data. At first, he didn't seem to be acting on the information at all, merely studying it with grateful enthusiasm. However, after another week of this, he became obsessed with a Google Earth photo that Lysol had shown him. Prow gazed at it, studying its surface over and over. For over 24 hours, he did nothing but to look at the picture. Occasionally, he scribbled in his notebook. Later that afternoon, after a night in which I'm quite sure Prow got no sleep whatsoever, Prow called Lysol and me to discuss things. "This is a serious threat to this facility," Prow said with great conviction and passion. Lysol looked at it. "What is it?" Prow pointed to a smear on the map. "This is a hidden cruise missile pointed at this facility. Everyone here is in danger." "Who owns it?" "Demons," Prow said with authority. Lysol obviously thought that he hadn't heard that right. I'm sorry, did you say demons?" "Yes, I'm quite sure of it." Prow smiled confidently. "Don't you think that Ferret will didn't you think that Ferret was conjuring demons when you tracked him down?" I asked. "Yes," Prow said, obviously annoyed at the question. "But there weren't demons at all, were they?" "Semantics," Prow cried. "You challenged me with semantics." "Hey," I looked at Lysol with amusement. Lysol just looked at Prow and didn't challenge Prow's statement any further. Brown-noser. He really was a good replacement for Darla. I'm just pointing out that for a self-proclaimed rationalist and agnostic, you're more than willing to believe in the supernatural Prow rolled his eyes. Must you be so literal, Chester? Of course I do not think there are any demons straight from the gates of hell. While it is theoretically possible that there are humanoids from an alternate timeline of excessive volcanic activity, I am speaking figuratively, not literally. So they're just devil worshippers, I asked? Also possible. But I consider any man who would inflict injustice upon another solely for his own profit or petty gain to be a demon. Prow stood up and clasped his hands behind his back. He began to pace. He was in full lecture mode now. Demon to me is the only appropriate term for such people. Even money is slightly more absolvable as a motive for some of humanity's crimes than those who are demonic. Starting a war for petty vengeance, that is demonic. Spawning children for the excess purpose of selling muffins, that is demonic. And setting up a cruise missile to blow up Fleur simply because it challenges Russian sovereignty, even when it is beyond their borders, is demonic. I blinked. That was very confusing. Why couldn't Prow just say things like that up front? Did he expect us to all think like him? How was any sane person to make a leap of logic from demonic to that? Why would Russia do that? I thought Ferret had fooled them into thinking that this was a Russian facility and that he was buying them off. He did, but he was only doing it to too many. But he started doing it to too many countries. The SVR is not the KGB, but they had to notice that bribes were going to other countries mimic their own sooner or later. Then there are the other things. Prow continued to pace. He paused. Like what? I was falling into sidekick mode again, but it was simply the best way to get information out of Prow. Glad you asked. Did you know that a jet flew over us just now had no pilot? He looked smug. What? I was not thrilled with where this is going. No, it's true. Doi had a military drone program for years. It's been under the radar for most of that because they didn't want the public to know about it. But they have observers at each of the Pentagon's competitions in recent years. Another pause. I sighed. Competitions? I could have said onomatopoeia, and Prow would have answered the same way. The Pentagon has been holding regular competitions in the last 2 decades to gain more and more autonomous drones. Doi hasn't been attending them except, as I said, with an observer status to get ideas for their own program. I might also add that in recent years this program has moved here. Doi isn't taking the path that most military drone manufacturers are taking either. They're building full-size fighter aircraft here on Hlur. That surprised me. So the Russians don't want Hlur to sell their planes to us, to the U.S.? No. I don't think you realize the stakes here, Chester. Doi also funds numerous physics programs, particularly small cutting-edge ones. They were involved with the Time Viewer research. They're also involved with quantum teleportation. I waited. I didn't ask any questions this time. Quite frankly, I didn't quite grok the leap from demons to quantum mechanics. Lysol finally coughed and explained, Scientists are explaining teleporting particles over distance. This probably doesn't mean much yet as far as magically making a handball move from New York to Chicago in the blink of an eye, but it does mean an increase in bandwidth for computer environments. Prow nodded. Virtual environments. Reaction time. In other words, a drone doesn't have to be autonomous. It can be directly and reliably linked to a human controlling them on the ground from anywhere. Well, that's great. Less people dying in war. At least that was the idea, I suppose, Prow sighed. In my experience, that technology almost universally increases the number of people who die in war, not the other way around. I still don't see how this threatens Russia, and I couldn't. I just didn't make any sense. Where you see a military program save lives, the Russians see a corporate arcology with cutting-edge technology and a high-tech lethal air force. Tell me, Chester, we're sitting in one of the largest oil reserves on the planet right now. Exactly which nation controls it? Prow stopped pacing and looked directly at me. Well, I guess the U.S. does. I didn't know. Then I remembered all the talk about conspiracies earlier. No nation controls it, Chester. None at all, which makes Hlur a very tempting target. The U.S. and Russia aren't on friendly terms anymore, but at least they are known quantities to each other. Hlur is something new, and let me assure you, Russians don't like surprises, not those kinds of surprises. Prow sat down in his chair. So what do we do? I asked. What we are being paid to do. Notify Gerald. Prow said and stood up. That didn't sound like a good idea to Lysol, but he didn't say anything first. He just sat there in deep thought. Fine. What's up? I asked as Prow stepped just by the door and looked back. Some people just could not take the initiative. Well, Lysol said, it sounded like he was taking dramatic license in the situation. All we have for proof is a blurred photo. Maybe we should investigate it some more. We didn't need true drama kings. Prow's brow furrowed. He wasn't used to actually having to present proof for anything. We could go check it out. That wasn't a good idea. Excuse me, but that's in Russia. If the Russians are annoyed at us, I don't really think landing on the beach and snooping around their country is exactly going to go over well on their side, Lysol said. Well, maybe we could just fly over it, Prow nodded. We could use my jet. I didn't have the heart to correct him. Go figure. Wouldn't one of those drones be better? Nonsense. We'll be fine. This was a point I was not willing to compromise on. I am not sneaking into a foreign nation to spy on their military without backup, period. This seemed to bother Lysol. In fact, the fact that it bothered him bothered me. What's your problem? Lysol looked at me startled. What? No, nothing at all. Good. Then we're all agreed that we're going to tell Gerald. I would not be dissuaded. Prow stiffened. If you go, I'll tell them to let you go. I laughed. Prow frowned and then grimly smiled. Oh no, I know how much you like this job now. You need me. I called his bluff. No, I don't. I've got Lysol now. If you think that I'm so attached to this job that I'm willing to die for it, think again. If you go out that door, you're fired, Prow sneered. I could tell he was serious now. I didn't care. Lysol was just very quiet, sneakily quiet. Okay, I started to leave the room. What amazed me was how surprised Prow looked. He had re-entered his little fantasy world just that fast. Speaking of fantasy worlds, I noticed a large pink invisible unicorn smiling down the hall. I belatedly felt a prick in the back of my neck. But though through my haze I decided that I had felt the prick algebra penguin meatloaf, after whatever drug they loaded me up with had traveled backwards in time, I floated in a pink and purple haze of clouds until we reached an iceberg. There was a very nice red-headed girl on the Titanic, and we made out until I realized that with both of my brains that she was dead and a seat cushion at the same time. I vaguely recognized the barrel of an AK-47 staring at my face, with a great deal of Russian being spoken around me. I was lying on a concrete floor and vaguely recalled hearing a metal door slam shut before passing out yet again. I woke up and found that a bucket of water to the face is not the most pleasant of experiences. I would not recommend it to anyone. This is especially true with water that has obviously quite recently been snow in a Siberian winter. The ugliest guard in the world stared at me backlit by a single swinging light bulb, which dangled from the ceiling and bumped into his military buzz cut as he moved his head into its path. Ugly said something in Russian. He then beat me upside the head for the sin of failing to reply or understand him. Mental note, learn Russian. He continued this cycle to question, slap for about 7 or 8 cycles before the large steel door behind me that I could hear but not see opened, and a female started a harsh guttural gibberish. It sounded like Klingon. I didn't care if Russian came first. It still sounded like Klingon. A short while later, a blonde woman with yet another clock-stopper face but a supermodel body entered and spoke in English, rather perfectly, I might add. Who are you? There is a temptation in every human being to answer name, rank, and serial number, but fortunately, I had the presence of mind to keep my sarcasm to safety of my own home-written notebook, hidden where no one would ever read or find it until several weeks later. And yet, gentle reader, that means I am not narrating this as a ghost from the afterlife. I hope that does not disappoint you, I answered. My name is Chester A. Arthurson. I'm an American. I was kidnapped, drugged, and taken against my will somewhere to what I assume is Russia. The woman, whose face was actually not quite that ugly, said, Who took you? Where do you think you were taken? Quiescence Prow and Darren Lysol. I assume they took me to a smudge on a satellite photograph that they thought was a cruise missile pointed at Fleur. She looked shocked. Cruise missile? I nodded. That's what Prow thought it was. I mean, I take it wasn't? She didn't answer, but did ask, You say they drugged you? Why? That's complicated. She didn't like the answer. Enlighten me. I tried to think of a simple but truthful answer as I could. My boss basically thinks he's a psychic. Fleur hired him to find any threats against it. My boss can't do his thing if I'm not there. She grinned and laughed. And are you a psychic too? I shook my head. There was a mistake since it hurt. A lot. No. I'm just a normal guy who, for some reason, my boss thinks makes his powers work. Only I paused. How does one say this? Yes. He doesn't really seem to think of them as psychic powers. He thinks he's Sherlock Holmes. She laughed at this point, and translated it for the guard. Ugly laughed. He sounded like a car stuttering as it stalled. Gah-heh, gah-heh, gah-heh. Apparently the other guard behind me, that I couldn't see, thought it was funny too. I waited for them to finish their little yuck fest. The woman finally said, All right, we will find out if your story checks out, Chester. She left. Ugly grinned at me. He bent down in front of me and said something in Klingon. I merely shrugged, though that hurt too. Ugly only laughed. I waited several hours. It should have seemed like days, but I have been in prison. I could do time, though the pain didn't get any easier. In fact, the zip ties that had been tied to my hands to the chair were so tight I was slowly losing circulation. Eventually, Blondie returned and said, "Your story checks out. You are free to go. Is it possible for me to press charges against Prow and Lysol?" She looked confused for a moment and then laughed. She said something in Klingon, then shook her head. "How the hell would I know?" and left it at that. A short while later, I was released and limped through the thoroughly pleasant, well-lit, and comfortable prison into a waiting room with Prow. They set me down next to him and left. Prow whispered to me with clenched teeth, "What did you tell them?" "The truth." "All of it?" He sounded incredulous and angry. "Yep." "How could you?" He sneered at me. "Because I can. Because you drugged me." Prow frowned and punctured his anger somewhat. "That wasn't me. That was Darren." "Of course." Prow was silent. "So what exactly did you two do once you got here?" "Not now. Later." "Of course. Good point. The Klingons might hear us." "What?" They returned us to Fleur without any comment. Prow remained silent the entire time. Gerald, Ferret, and Darla were there to meet us when we arrived. They were all quite happy. Ferret slapped Prow on the back and said, "I knew you were worth the investment. You were worth every penny it cost me to bring you here." I was still confused. What exactly did he do? Did the Russians move I stopped when Prow elbowed me in the ribs, knocking the wind out of me. Ferret didn't notice, but Darla and Gerald suddenly looked very suspicious. Ferret ignored them. "Come this way. We have something very important to announce," Darla said. "Do you have something you want to tell us, Quiescence?" "Yes. Lysol was a spy for the United States government." That was surprising. Ferret looked confused, but Darla and Gerald smiled. Gerald said, "Yes, we knew. We actually had the Russians call us and thank us." "Huh?" Prow said, "Why would the government want to spy on you?" Prow seemed relieved at Prow's suspicion. Ferret seemed relieved at Prow's suspicion, and Darla and Gerald were slightly happier. Normally, I wouldn't have cared that Prow had information about it, but there was a little game of sorts being played here, and no one was acknowledging my presence. I didn't like that. Ferret said, "I think the United States government is spying on us for the same reason that you thought the Russians were." Prow's surprise told me what he had been attempting to conceal was no secret. Mental note, kick his ass later. "Then why are you all so pleased?" "Because that smudge you found wasn't a cruise missile at all. It was a deep-cover CIA listening post, designed, among other things, to keep an eye on us. Apparently no one thought to use internet mapping services. Lysol underestimated your ability to find this kind of thing. He tried to stop you, and failing that, tried to get you to go where it could kidnap you both." I wondered if they'd known I'd been kidnapped by Lysol and Prow. I wondered if they cared. Prow nodded agreement. "That makes sense. What does not make sense is why the U.S. government," Darla interjected. "The CIA," Prow continued. "The CIA would care what we're doing here. They must already know about Dewey." "Some," Garrett answered. "Angel Flight and FluxLink are certainly worthy of concern and notice, though we admit that's not the reason they were so concerned either." "Then what was?" Prow asked. Ferret smiled. "As you probably learned by now, I'm a show guy, not a teller. This way." Prow looked from Gerald to Darla for explanation, but Gerald only shrugged, and Darla didn't even do that as she followed Ferret inside. After all, she had a habit and history of accepting her ex-husband's rather eccentric behaviors. Down into the depths of the island we went, through its service corridors, bustling with all activity of an anthive. The chamber we entered was vast, about as long as a football field, and twice as wide. There were over 6 rows of tiered computers, and each wall was decorated with art that surrounded dozens of display screens. A large globe hovered in the center of the room 15 feet in the air, showing each nation in a hue ranging from red to green. Fleur was highlighted by a large white dot that glowed brighter than any of the other nations. Beneath the globe, several dozen people stood gathered together in silent dignity. They formed a horseshoe around a table that had a ribbon parchment laying on it. They clapped and cheered as Ferret approached. "Quiescence Prow, I'd like to introduce you to the People's Assembly of the Republic of Fleur." The Republic of Fleur? Suddenly it all fell into place. Fleur wasn't a corporate arcology. They were actually going to declare themselves to be a different country. That piece of paper had to be their constitution. Ferret stood up and began to speak. My fellow citizens, we have waited for this moment a long time, but we are finally going to form our own nation. Unlike the times in decades past when this has been tried, Blur has teeth. Blur can defend herself if other nations try and take our freedom, despite every legal right under international law to do so. Unlike other nations, we will obey the rule of law, but since past observation has shown that most other nations on Earth favor only the rule of the gun, we are more than capable of accommodating them. Still, we are not naive. To achieve true freedom, we need to convince the people of Earth, not their governments, that we are not a threat. That is why Project Mercury is of such vital importance. It would not have been possible if it had not been the discoveries of one man. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Quiescence Prow. The cheering was thunderous. Everyone in the room but Prow and I erupted into applause. It was too much, even for him. For once, Quiescence Prow jaw dropped, and he didn't even know what to say. Eventually, the cheering drew down, and Ferret continued to speak. For the final act of our Declaration of Independence, we shall sign our Constitution and founding principles. He moved forward and signed a very large, prominent letters so that everyone could see. They had displayed the documents on several nearby terminals. I was no expert on government systems, but I glanced over it, and I was pretty impressed. These guys were making a serious attempt at this, not just saying that their corporations owned everything. They had an upper house and a lower house. The upper house consisted of those who owned the most stock in the 5 founding corporations, as long as they were a citizen. The lower house consisted of volunteers from among the citizens who were randomly selected for 1-year terms. They had to be willing to devote 10 to 20 hours a week towards running the complex. They had a court and a popularly elected president. I couldn't see anything like this working in a really large country, but it seemed to work for them. They had a Bill of Rights, and that was pretty impressive too. It basically was just like the U.S. Bill of Rights with a few major differences. The freedom of speech section was almost 2 pages. The government couldn't restrict any kind of speech, but speech had to be labeled as press, entertainment, politics, literature, or other. The press label had the most restriction because it had to be, quote, true, end quote. Willful slander or attempts to ruin or distort the truths were heavily liable in civil court, almost draconically so. What surprised me most was how liberal the right of any individual of a majority age to own any weapon used by infantry and armies past or present. That or the property clause, which flat out stated government may never tax the value of a property. It was particularly interesting in that it was clearly written to apply to space as well. How could they enforce that? One by one, the signers moved up and put their name on the document. They treated it as if it were a solemn occasion. Darla signed, Gerald signed, Abraham signed. Prow and I just watched. Prow mainly watched Ferret and Darla, but his face was an unreadable mask.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!
Welcome to the secret commentary at the end of every chapter. I'm Tom Ricks / Rhombus Tix / Emmett Other. And this is about chapter 10. So, I'm going to give this chapter a C. There are some chapters in this book that really shine, that I get as high as B. I don't think any chapter gets an A from me. Some of the stories I write do on Swamp Castle. There's a reason I consider this my worst novel, and I think this chapter highlights it, right? The main reason I'm doing this commentary is to try and salvage something out of this novel and do writing lessons. So let's talk about what worked well, right? I love calling the Russians Klingons. In fact, given what they're doing right now in Ukraine, I was kind of astonished at how, when I chose to do this novel at the beginning of the year, how timely this was, despite the fact that parts of it, including the technology that's supposed to be near future, which is now actual present day, i.e. the use of drones and full fighter drones, albeit not quantum data teleportation, are front and center. I originally set it in Siberia because that to me seemed more likely for a large undiscovered oil patch to be found, or offshore of Siberia in international waters. But now I think it would be far more interesting to put it in the North Sea. Russia tends to pay a lot more attention to the North Sea and the Black Sea. In fact, putting it in the Black Sea would be wow. But either way, between Turkey and Russia, it would be very interesting from an international diplomacy standpoint. Other problems. There's too many characters, right? Between Michael Onyx, Ferret, and the guy whose name begins with G that I literally can't remember the name of, there's too many people in the conspiracy, right? Having minor characters that show up once or twice and are still well-rounded and interesting, but there when you need them in a multiple book series makes sense. Like, one of my favorite C-list characters in the Dresden Files is Hendrix, the bodyguard of Marcone. He's very well-rounded. He shows up when he's needed to. He does have a very, very slight arc if you notice it over the books, but in general, he's kind of a stereotype. He's there when you need him. He has a name. He is very distinctive. He's very visually distinctive. Whereas in this, the difference between Michael Onyx, Ferret, and person whose name begins with G just kind of blurs together. Ferret is required because somebody has to be in charge of the conspiracy. Michael Onyx is kind of a lieutenant that does sneaky things, and he's the only character that appears in both the first and second novel. So G is totally superfluous. He just doesn't need to exist. Ferret, I forget. Anyway, the guy who works for the CIA and betrays Prow in this chapter and then goes off screen for the rest of it is fine. But that's 4 characters crammed into a chapter when 3 is all that's required. One of the reasons I give it a C. The other reason I give it a C is because this could have been a very interesting chapter, and parts of it are. But as is so often clearly shown in my early writing, I cheat, right? And occasionally that works. Occasionally in a movie, when you have a limited amount of budget or you don't want to show something, not showing something on screen can be more powerful than showing it on screen. But I do it way too much. And when I have the CIA guy jab Watson in the neck because he's about to go tell Garrett about the secret CIA site, I should show that, right? At minimum, I should have him see like a shadow or something, or hear somebody coming up behind him and inject him in the neck. And instead, I go immediately to the drug-induced hallucination, which can be very fun to write. And then he wakes up being interrogated by Klingons. And I think that, sorry, I'll never get tired of calling Russians Klingons. But I think that, I should have showed it, right? And, a little bit of tweaking could really make this chapter really sing. And it's one of these things that's very frustrating about this novel, because I tried editing it like 5 or 6 times. I've never paid an editor for this one. Is that it came so close to something that could work, right? I mean, if you think about just the basic structure of the novel, it was actually a really good idea, right? A monster of the week with a happy-go-lucky, crazy lunatic playing at Sherlock Holmes, who turns out to be right and gets recruited for the very conspiracy that he tries to find. And then it becomes international politics. That could work. I could rewrite it and make it work. But as you can see, assuming anybody's even still listening at this point, as you can see from the way it rolls out, it's just got problems. The characters aren't relatable. It focuses on the wrong things. there's too many characters that when there should be less, and there should be more characters, it almost works time and time again, and it's very frustrating to me. Honestly, there's not much more for me to comment on this chapter that I haven't already said, so I'm going to end this one now.